The following program presents principles designed to promote good health and is not intended to take the place of personalized professional care. The opinions and ideas expressed are those of the speaker. Viewers are encouraged to draw their own conclusions about the information presented.
Welcome to Health for a Lifetime. I'm your host, Don McIntosh, and today we're going to talk about something you hear a lot about, at least in America, and that is protein. High protein diets versus not having those, but it's all the rage right now, and it seems to go in cycles. And talking with us about protein today is Dr. Neil Nedley. We're glad you're with us today. And this is a topic that seems to cycle over every 30, 40 years.
There's a lot of myths about it. We call it the great meat and protein myth.
Okay, so we want to talk about that. What is protein? What's it made up of? And help us swerve through the narrows here.
Well, protein actually is made up of amino acids. Amino acids are the building blocks of protein.
Okay.
And there are 8 essential amino acids that are necessary in a human's diet. And if we don't get all 8 of those in the proper quantities, we're going to end up with problems.
Okay.
And as a result of that, people erroneously concluded back around the World War II era that we needed to get so much of those 8 that there was no problem getting an excess, just to assure that we're getting the 8. And so they were recommending animal bases of protein as being superior because it had higher protein contents.
So I think we have a graphic showing the proteins. You want to work us through that, or the amino acids?
Yes, Dr. Rose debunked this myth, but he found out that all 8 of the essential amino acids were in sweet potatoes alone, and those are the amounts of each one of the 8, starting with the red and ending with the purple there. All 8 essential amino acids were present in proper amounts in baked potatoes, brown rice, tomatoes, pumpkin, and in whole wheat. And in addition to that, corn, rolled oats, white beans, asparagus, and you can see the huge amounts there in asparagus and beans and broccoli. And now you can see the recommended amounts. That's what he found out was actually needed. And that was double the amount. His recommended amount was double the amount that he found for any grown, very active man.
So, in other words, the take-home from that is that you can get all your protein in any one of those?
Any one of those foods if you are eating enough to maintain your weight. Now, that was, we wouldn't recommend eating enough potatoes to maintain your weight. You'd have to eat a large amount of potatoes, for instance, to do that. But that helps explain something. I was teaching this actually in a nutrition course in my town. And one of the ladies taking the course was in her 70s. And she said, this explains why we survived the Great Depression. I said, what do you mean? She said, all we had were white potatoes. That's all we ate for years during the Great Depression because our family couldn't afford anything else. We thought we'd all die out, but we grew, and the kids grew, and it was normal. And yeah, they were probably shorting themselves in some nutrients, but they weren't shorting themselves in protein. Because they got all 8 essential amino acids.
That's fascinating. And I've heard people also talk about actually over in Germany at the different concentration camps, they would feed them just potatoes or just that. And at the end of the war, of course, the people that were in those camps that didn't get killed were actually healthier than the soldiers that came to emancipate them.
That's right. Because they weren't getting too much protein, and that's the flip side of this, is if we're so worried about getting enough protein, chances are we're eating a lot of animal bases of protein, and the animal protein actually can give us too much. And in excess, protein produces urea, and urea acts as a diuretic, but it not only gets rid of fluid, but it will also get rid of calcium. diuretics virtually never just get rid of fluid. They always take something else with it. Some diuretics will take potassium, some will take sodium. The urea takes calcium with it. And with that, of course, 99% of the calcium being in the bones, with that, we will also lose bone mineral density. And it's one of the reasons why meat has been so strongly associated with osteoporosis.
So there's another reason to get your protein from plants is basically what you're saying.
That's right. And that is it can help prevent osteoporosis. The study that we have on a graphic shows that when we're eating just 48 grams of protein a day, we will save 20 milligrams of calcium per day. That means 19 of those 20 milligrams end up in the bones. When we're eating 95 grams of protein, we lose 40 milligrams of calcium per day. And if we eat 142 grams, and these people on these high protein diets are doing that, they're losing actually over 100 milligrams of protein per day. And that's a huge amount, and over time it'll cause loss of bone mineral density.
You mean they're losing not protein but calcium is what you meant to say?
That's right, losing calcium.
Okay.
And the protein is actually, the excess protein is leaching calcium out of the bones.
Okay. So each one of those graphics, it was actually they're losing calcium the more protein they eat.
The more protein they eat, right.
Okay. So what is then this, this is probably somehow associated with all the hip fractures and all these other things we see in a country where this myth is prevalent, that is that we should eat meat to get our protein rather than the plant sources where we could get it.
That's right. The plant sources, of course, are the original primary sources of protein. You know, the cow, where does it get all its protein from? You know, it's a total vegetarian, essentially, and it's getting it from the greens, and that's a much better way of getting it.
Mm-hmm. So I think you have a graphic that then shows the relationship between the calcium level and the hip fracture level.
Yes, it's kind of interesting that the higher the calcium intake, you know, up to 1,000 milligrams a day, the higher the hip fracture risk. And you can see Denmark, U.S., United Kingdom, they're all up there in calcium intake, and they're also up there in hip fracture. And here we have South Africa way down the rate, only 200 milligrams of calcium per day, and their hip fracture rates are extremely low, which help us to realize, now this doesn't mean that calcium causes the hip fractures, but interestingly, the societies that eat the most calcium also eat the most protein and the most salt and the most sugar. And all of these together can lead to osteoporosis. And so we're actually getting rid of more calcium in the body than what we're putting in. Where the South Africans, they spare it all, essentially, because being on a much higher plant-based diet and not having the sugar and excess salt.
So that's fascinating. I mean, we try and do things the wrong way. We try and say, okay, we'll eat all kinds of protein from animal sources, and it hurts us. And then we say, okay, we'll try and take calcium supplements, and it doesn't really help us.
That's right. It's much better to get your calcium from plant foods instead of animal foods.
And what are some foods that are high in calcium if I'm going down to the store? I need some foods that have calcium.
Well, you can see oatmeal, as good as it is, doesn't have a lot of calcium. 1 cup, just 19 milligrams. And lentils, 38 milligrams, and that should be calcium content in milligrams. Quinoa, 102 milligrams. Rutabagas, 115 milligrams of calcium. Mustard greens, a much higher source, 1 cup, 152. Kale, which is my favorite green, 1 cup, 179 milligrams of calcium. And then we have foods that are extremely high in calcium, and those would be turnip greens, 1 cup, 249 milligrams of calcium. Soybeans, 1 cup, 261 milligrams. You can see milk where it lines up, whole milk 290, skim milk 301. But there are higher sources. Carob flour is one of those, 358 milligrams of calcium. And the highest source of calcium is actually lamb's quarters. Now that is not the hind leg of a small sheep. Lamb's quarters is actually a green. It grows as a weed where I'm from in Oklahoma. very tasty green, very tender, and very high in calcium.
Is that right? So the highest sources of calcium are not milk, but plants again.
Yes, greens are excellent sources. One exception to that would be spinach. Spinach has a lot of calcium too, but it also has a lot of oxalate, so we're not really absorbing that calcium like we are going to from kale. Kale, it's absorbed to a high degree. Even lamb's quarters, it's absorbed to a high degree.
And I might tell you, those of you who are watching, you think, my kids won't eat kale. My kids love kale.
All right.
For some reason. I mean, they didn't get that from me. I'm learning to love kale. But man, their mother and the kids, they sit around, they just, could I have some more kale? They're screaming in the background. And they love it. They put a little lemon on it, and that doesn't do anything bad, does it?
No.
No. And they just sit there, and they just like have a kale feast. And, it's amazing. I should actually take a video, maybe roll it in the next time we do this program, because people are not believing me. But they do. They do love kale.
Yes.
And maybe I'll have to just put some lamb's quarters in there as well.
Other good sources of calcium are sesame seeds. Sesame is a good source. Tahini would be a good source of calcium. And figs also are excellent sources of calcium.
Well, what about sodium? Is there any connection between protein and sodium?
Well, there is in regards to osteoporosis. A lot of people don't realize that high sodium in the diet also leaches calcium out of the bones.
Is that right?
High sodium will not only cause high blood pressure, it not only increases the risk of heart disease, but it also significantly increases the risk of kidney stones because it's leaching calcium out of the bones and putting it into the urine. And it also is one of the major contributors to osteoporosis.
Wow. So you have a graphic on this, on sodium foods and where we are. Let's look at that.
Yes. The average American diet has 4,000 milligrams of sodium a day.
Wow.
Those with normal blood pressure should not have more than 2,400 milligrams a day. Those with high blood pressure, no more than 2,000 milligrams a day. And those with high blood pressure and congestive heart failure or liver problems, 1,000 milligrams a day. Some people with high blood pressure should only be on 1,000 because their blood pressure would drop a lot better. But we do need some sodium in the diet, a minimum of 250 milligrams a day. If you're on a sodium-free diet, that would not be recommended. And so this is why if you're totally on a plant-based diet, for instance, if you're a total vegetarian, you would want to add a little bit of sodium. Wouldn't have to be a lot, but plant foods are so low in sodium that you might short yourself if you didn't add a little bit.
Well, what are these foods that are so high in sodium in the American diet?
Well, the prepared foods. You go to any restaurant and people think in order to enhance the taste for the general public, you have to dump sodium into them.
When we come back, we're going to look at a list of foods that are high in sodium, just in case you haven't figured out which ones are. I'm going to talk more about some of these myths as they're related to protein and calcium. Join us when we come back.
Are you confused about the endless stream of new and often contradictory health information? With companies trying to sell new drugs and special interest groups paying for studies that spin the facts, where can you find a common-sense approach to health? One way is to ask for your free copy of Dr. Arnott's 24 Realistic Ways to Improve Your Health. Dr. Timothy Arnott and the Lifestyle Center of America produced this helpful booklet of 24 short, practical health tips based on scientific research and the Bible that will help you live longer, happier, and healthier. For example, did you know that women who drink more water lower the risk of a heart attack? Or that 7 to 8 hours of sleep a night can minimize your risk of ever developing diabetes? Find out how to lower your blood pressure and much more. If you're looking for help, not hype, then this booklet's for you. Just log on to 3abn.org and click on free offers or call us during regular business hours. You'll be glad you did.
Welcome back. We've been talking with Dr. Neil Nedley. We've been talking about some myths as they are associated with protein. High protein diets seem to be all the rage. And we've also talked about osteoporosis, its relationship to calcium and sodium, which was interesting. Dr. Nedley, we're glad you're with us.
Thank you.
Now, some of these things are brand new. You have a lot of the baseline things in your book, Proof Positive. People that want information about that can go to your webpage, nedleypublishing.com, and they can read the base thing. But you're sharing some new things with us.
Yes, and one of those new things is that a high sodium diet actually leaches calcium out of the system. and it can lead to osteoporosis. Also, if we don't have enough calcium on board, we don't make enough melatonin at night. So it can even cause premature graying. It can cause increase the risk of certain cancers because of not enough of the antioxidant melatonin on board.
So are you trying to talk about my gray hair subtly? Is that what you're trying to say?
Well, I mean, there's genetically, we are all programmed to get gray at a certain point. So as we get older, it's actually normal to gray. But we don't want the premature graying.
Okay.
And if we run into calcium deficits, we're going to run into some premature graying.
So you're just saying I'm getting older. I appreciate that. Well, all right. Well, Dr. Nedley, you know, we want to look at some foods that are higher in sodium. Which foods are higher in sodium? You kind of have a quiz for us here. Which
yes,
of these?
I'd like you all to take this quiz that are watching here today. Corn chips, what do you think is higher? 1 cup of corn chips or 1 cup of corn flakes? Then, which do you think is higher, a 1/4 cup of peanuts or a can of tomato soup? Then, what do you think is higher, a half cup of frozen peas or a half cup of canned peas? And then, which is higher, a cup of buttermilk or a cup of cottage cheese? 1 small bag of potato chips or a cup of instant mashed potatoes? And then again, which is higher, a serving of French fries or a serving of ice cream, soft serve?
Well, I'm ready to take the quiz. I'm sure everyone at home has written those down and they have their answers. Let's look at the answers.
Well, actually, each one that was second in the list was the highest. Notice the corn flakes higher than the corn chips. Cereals, except if it's shredded wheat, tends to be pretty high in sodium. The peanuts, 155 milligrams, but look at that can of tomato soup, 932 milligrams.
Wow.
Frozen peas, only 70 milligrams. Canned peas are going to have higher sodium content, 340. Buttermilk, moderately high. Dairy is moderately high in calcium, 257. But look at that cottage cheese, 850 milligrams. That small bag of potato chips, 168 milligrams, but instant mashed potatoes, quite high, 491 milligrams. French fries, 123, but that ice cream, again, dairy moderately high, 220 milligrams of sodium. And so the take-home message from this is to read your labels. A lot of people say, hey, I don't use much salt because they're not using a salt shaker routinely. But getting rid of the salt shaker only gets rid of less than 1/3 of the sodium consumed in America. 2/3 of it is already dumped into the foods before we ever eat it. And so that means reading the labels is important. You may not be thinking you're on a high sodium diet, but once you read those labels, you may find out that your sodium intake is too high and is contributing to a number of problems.
Like you said, osteoporosis, which is new for some of us. And
that's right.
You also said lower melatonin, gray hair.
That's right.
I mean, that right alone is going to stimulate a lot of people to do this.
To start lowering their sodium intake.
So what are some foods that are low in sodium? You said shredded wheat was the only cereal that you know, or is Total okay?
Well, Total is going to have more because they do put sodium in there. Shredded wheat, there's no sodium added.
Okay.
And so the foods that are whole plant foods, we have a graphic showing you the foods that are very low in sodium. And even peas are going to be very low. The frozen peas still have some sodium added into it. Your average serving of fresh fruit, 6 milligrams of sodium. Average grains, whole grains and cereals, 7 milligrams of sodium. If your nuts are unsalted, only 3 milligrams of sodium. Vegetables have a little higher, 15 milligrams, and then shredded wheat, 1 serving, only 3 milligrams. And if you add up all of the sodium there, in those plant foods, you may not have your minimum of 250 milligrams a day, and that's why it's okay if you're on a totally plant-based diet to add a little bit of sodium there. But for the average individual who's buying all these prepared foods, not only should they not use the salt shaker, they really need to limit their intake of these prepared foods.
What about these salt substitutes like potassium and other things they put on? What do you say about those?
Well, potassium chloride is better than sodium chloride for the average person. However, if you have some mild renal failure, it can be dangerous because you're not getting rid of the potassium, and it can actually cause the heart to stop. Also, we're finding out it's not so much the sodium that's the problem, but it's the chloride. And potassium chloride still has the chloride molecule, and that chloride molecule is still going to end up dumping a little bit of calcium.
Interesting. So when we reduce our sodium, you have a graphic that helps us know what we're reducing our risk of.
Yes, we're reducing our risk of high blood pressure. You can drop your blood pressure up to 20 points by getting on a diet that's 1,000 milligrams of sodium per day. It's been shown to reduce the risk of heart attack, no matter what other underlying risk factors of heart attack that you have. In addition, it reduces the complications of congestive heart failure, cirrhosis of the liver, and kidney failure, reduces the risk of stomach and nasopharyngeal cancer, reduces osteoporosis, and reduces kidney stones. Speaking of congestive heart failure, I knew of several individuals, one in particular, that every time she would have even like a bowl of soup, she would end up in the emergency room with fulminant congestive heart failure. I'd have to intubate her, put her on the ventilator, and give her a strong talking to in regards to not eating high sodium foods. She'd be good for a while, and then a temptation would come, and boom, she'd do it again. And she'd end up in the ICU almost on death's door. And this happened repeatedly. We've had the dietitian come talk to her, etc. But sometimes that soup became so tempting
Enamoring.
that she thought, well, you know, maybe I'll get by with it this time. She ended up dying. One time she got to the emergency room too late after her high sodium foods. It was pickles, I think. Pickles are also quite loaded in sodium. She had some pickles and some French fries, and boom, that was it.
That was it.
And that's because her heart was so weak that
How old was this individual?
She was in her 70s.
In her 70s. So when you're on the edge, especially.
Yeah, you'll know the difference right away. And of course, a lot of people don't have that immediate feedback on their body. It's just paying a toll in the slow, gradual downturn. And then eventually they have the feedback when sometimes it's too late.
So the protein problem, the calcium problem, and the sodium problem is causing all kinds of osteoporosis.
And then another piece of new information as far as osteoporosis. We now know that refined sugar also leaches calcium from the bones. In fact, it may do so more so than the protein in meat. At least the recent studies show this. So a lot of people are just worried about their calcium. Maybe they're lowering their protein if they have osteoporosis. They also need to watch out for the sodium and the sugar.
Okay. Now, when should, I want to look at it. You have a graphic on preventing osteoporosis. I want to look at it in a minute. But when should people start being concerned about it? When they're 60, 70?
No, before that. Really, we start tending to lose bone mineral density after the age of 20, 25. And so it's not a bad idea if you have access to get a bone mineral density in your 40s and see where you're at before. By the time you're in the 60s, osteoporosis can be so severe that you can maintain, but you won't be able to catch back up again.
Okay, so if you're in the 20s, you should be listening to this program.
Absolutely.
Okay, preventing osteoporosis. You have a graphic that helps us.
Yes, restricting animal protein, restricting sodium intake, getting enough absorbable calcium in the diet, particularly from the greens, sesame. Magnesium is also important. We need half as much magnesium as calcium. And then gravity exercises. That means brisk walking, running. Swimming is not one of those real gravity exercises. And then if you're standing for more than 4 hours a day routinely, that's been shown to reduce the risk as well.
Okay. Wonderful. What about animal protein and certain glandular or lymph cancers?
Well, that's the other problem with too much animal protein. It does seem to increase the risk of cancers. In fact, T. Colin Campbell has written an entire book on this. When we get too much of the essential amino acids, it suppresses the immune system and cancer tends to come about. And lymphoma is one of those. Studies have shown that according to the graph that we have as a graphic, the higher the animal protein intake, the higher the incidence of lymphoma worldwide.
So let's look at this graphic and we'll see that. You can see kind of an increase as it goes up there towards United States again.
That's right. Japan, lower amounts of animal protein, virtually no lymphoma. Yugoslavia is higher. And then when we get to the United Kingdom, Netherlands, Denmark, U.S., we have high animal protein intake, particularly beef protein, and we have much higher rates of lymphoma.
And that even New Zealand, I think, on other graphs I've seen, is very high as well.
Right.
Talk to me then about low-protein diets in terms of what they do with kidney failure.
Well, this has been an interesting phenomenon. For years, the medical profession was taught, I was taught in medical school, that once a diabetic started to get dumping protein in their urine, they were automatically going to be on dialysis if they lived long enough. In other words, their kidneys would continue to deteriorate year after year. In fact, every diabetic every year, if they're being followed by a good doctor, is that getting their protein measured in their urine to make sure they're not on this course. And if they are, we can intervene at this point. We used to try to intervene by controlling the blood sugars. That didn't work. But what did work was not only controlling the blood sugars, but on top of that, lowering the protein in the diet. And once we put these diabetics on a 40-gram protein diet, which is adequate protein, you're still getting all eight of the essential amino acids, but you're not getting the excess in protein that's going to leach not only calcium from the bones, but the excess in protein will destroy nephrons. And we have a graphic that shows us this. You can see the individual, their kidney function had gone down significantly. They were filtering over 100 cc's of blood. Now it was only 50 cc's. Once you're down to 15, you're on dialysis. And then their kidneys stabilized by being on a low-protein diet. No worse function. What happened to the protein in their bloodstream? That's what the next slide goes over, and this is pretty amazing. The protein in their bloodstream increased. And you'd say, well, they're on a low-protein diet. Why did their protein increase? Because they were dumping less protein in their urine. Their kidneys actually were able to spare the protein. And so even though their kidneys were filtering the same, they weren't dumping the protein in their urine, and their body nutritional status actually improved significantly.
So when you are a diabetic and you start to have this dumping, the real solution there is not so much focusing on the sugar, although that's
we would still focus on that.
Yeah, still focus on that. But it is lessening the protein in the diet.
Lessening the protein in the diet. Getting on a strict low-protein diet will prevent you from needing dialysis in the future.
And again, it's back to Genesis 1:29. It's those foods as grown that are the best to eat if you're trying to lower that and get an adequate source.
Exactly.
So Genesis strikes again, back to the beginning.
Yep, that original diet that was good for man and women then are also good for humankind today.
Thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Nedley. And thank you for being with us for Health for a Lifetime. God bless you.